Hey, I'm Raji Rage, and I am the facilitator for Spilling the Tea, Transforming Masculinities in association with Healing Justice London. I'm going to be sharing with you a little summary about our first session on patriarchy. But just before that, just a little bit about me. So I'm 44 years old and I'm transgender. I have been for a while. I don't subscribe to the either or framework, so either male or female. And that extends beyond my identity to my wider politics. So, thinking through frameworks such as the dominator and dominated, or oppressor and oppressed. I believe there's a more complex entanglement that goes beyond the binary, but also there are other modes and other routes that we can take. My early socialization was growing up in a women's refuge, and that was as a survivor of domestic violence and childhood abuse. I grew up around feminism and feminists, and also those who didn't consider themselves feminists but who were resisting against patriarchal violence. My early 20s and my 30s were pretty much embedded in queer and trans community movements within London, but also transnationally. And that was really centered around what it means to be queer and trans, but also including issues such as trans health and creating valuable resources for our community networks. One of those resources was a zine that I produced in the early 2000s in my 20s, and that was entitled Masculine Femininities zine. That was really to connect to transgender networks, and it really connected to me a lot of networks across the globe, but also to more specifically look at the diversity of trans masculinities. I've also been part of various mediations. I've been part of a course on transforming conflict. And yeah, I'm really interested in bringing healing justice frameworks and transformative justice frameworks, which come from the US originally, or not only the US, but yeah, kind of more kind of born from activist movements from the US. And I really want to try to bring them to the UK where we might not be so familiar with them, but really thinking through harm and violence and how we address harm and deal with harm without creating more harm, or how we kind of work with harm reduction. So that's really the idea for the sessions. Each session is kind of themed with a different kind of topic. The first one was on patriarchy. We looked at two resources, and we kind of explored and unpacked what these resources meant to us as transmasculine people and our relationship to that. So yeah, really thinking through our positionalities, but also our responsibilities. So our positionalities to patriarchy and patriarchal violence and harm, but also our responsibilities to ourselves, to others, to our communities, and to feminisms as well. So we looked at two texts, and they were from Adrienne Marie Brown and Bell Hooks. And yeah, we kind of like explored these texts and did so critically, but with a lot of respect and yeah, kind of admiration for those resources. So the first text we looked at was Relinquishing Patriarchy, which is a blog post on Adrienne Marie Brown's um, website. And yeah, it begins with Dear Men, and also this is mostly a note to straight cis men, but also includes trans men, queer men, and all who participate in masculinity. It follows with a disclaimer, kind of an affirmative disclaimer. If you see yourself in these words, this is a love note to you. So again, coming from with compassion, coming with this kindness of kind of address. So we went through this article, and yeah, it kind of starts off with this really kind of nice way of coming to the self, right? So how the self is implicated. So Ada Marie Brown starts with, in this life I've been homophobic, transphobic, classist, ableist, and yes, patriarchal. So really thinking about embodying those behaviors and being part of kind of a system and implicating ourselves within that. So we felt that was really important to kind of really state that, and so we're not kind of always looking to the other as being part of kind of harm and violence, but how we are also part of that. it kind of follows on to speak to kind of what it means to be a woman and experience kind of patriarchal violence. But it also kind of speaks to growing up in early socialization. So speaking to early masculine socialization, and it speaks to kind of, yeah, doing one chore, but kind of doing that as a kind of a rare favor rather than a reasonable expectation of yeah, what it means to be a person in this world. It also speaks to kind of growing up maybe in a single parent, single mother household, and how, you know, your mother might be kind of trying to embody both those roles of mother and father, carrying some guilt, and also kind of trying to take on board all of those kind of labor roles rather than kind of involving you within that. Yeah, it kind of speaks to the roles and the labor involved in kind of caretaking, but also how being masculine socialized, that won't necessarily be yeah, very apparent to you in terms of what labor is involved, how crucial and how necessary that work is. So some of us discussed this and felt like it wasn't really speaking to us. So in the original address, we're being addressed or included within that address and within an umbrella of masculinity, but the experiences weren't really speaking to trans masculine experiences in particular, or we didn't feel that. As someone who also has grown up in a single parent, single mother household, I didn't feel, and someone who was socialized as a daughter and as female, or perceived in that way, I didn't feel like that really spoke to me in terms of my experience. I kind of experienced the opposite of taking on board a lot of labor, and that kind of going beyond my transgressing my gender role, because I was also doing that from a very young age. We kind of recognized that this article is, you know, speaking to patriarchy, which is a big subject. Someone mentioned that, you know, it did speak to them in terms of they felt it was addressing a very specific group of people, particularly Black men in the US context, and they felt recognized within that and felt like it really did speak to them, and it kind of made them more aware about their relationship to masculinity and patriarchy. So the article kind of ends with this kind of list, this kind of instructional guide to kind of deal with patriarchy. So first one is recognize that you're a man and you're part of patriarchy. Two, to be vigilant about masculinity growing toxic, and so on. There's about 14 or 15 points. Some of us kind of discussed this and what we thought about this kind of practical kind of instructional guide. So some people felt like it was useful and it would yeah, it kind of is a good starting point. Other people felt like it kind of also relinquishes that sense of responsibility and accountability if you're being told what you should do rather than thinking through, you know, for yourself what that should entail. Yeah, so this also comes with a link to a resource list. So this is a very practical kind of guide, which we really appreciate as well. And yeah, it's kind of speaking to other groups and organizations who are working on kind of masculinity and relationship to patriarchy and unpacking that, mostly in the US context. But yeah, we kind of discussed what that would mean in a UK context for us as well. So yeah, we kind of realized the limits of a blog post in kind of dealing with a subject like patriarchy, but also kind of yeah, felt that there was some limits, but also some really important points within that article. So we moved on to Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks. And yeah, it kind of like as a very kind of yeah, kind of first point, first text to come to, we felt like even though it's not really dealing with specifically with trans masculinity's relationship to patriarchy, the title Feminism is for Everybody just really implicates us all, you know, on equal terms. So even though we aren't being addressed specifically, we felt like we were being spoken to and it spoke to us. So we listened to part of that, and I'm going to play a little section here.
12. Feminist masculinity. When contemporary feminist movement first began, there was a fierce anti-male faction. Individual heterosexual women came to the movement from relationships where men were cruel, unkind, violent, unfaithful. Many of these men were radical thinkers who participated in movements for social justice.
So bell hooks really kind of introduces the text by kind of naming problems. So kind of naming this problem about feminism and how there was a man-hating fraction when it started in reaction to the male violence that the people were experiencing. So, but also naming that as a problem in terms of that kind of stuck with feminism in terms of it being seen as this kind of enemy or it could be dismissed as being this kind of enemy or man-hating. It also meant, and it kind of is spoken about later in The Will to Change, that it also meant that it wasn't really embraced by men because they really didn't see themselves within it. They saw it as a women's thing, a feminist thing, which in feminist is synonymous with only women. So yeah, that kind of locating that problem, but also locating the problem of that, there were also many men or masculine identified people who were also part of social justice movements who were still embodying patriarchy. So even though they had this politics of solidarity, it still played out. So that becomes really important to kind of to sit with in terms of how these things kind of sit together, right? So we moved on to The Will to Change, and that goes into kind of more depth and speaks to kind of speaks to locating feminism, but also critiquing it, and also speaking to patriarchy, and also critiquing that. So that we found this a very kind of nuanced text. We follow the chapter feminist manhood, and what we found really important to begin with is that bell hooks really speaks to patriarchy being part of a system, and that system is named as white supremacist capitalism. So it's kind of already intrinsically kind of linked to race, gender, and class, and that being part of a system of exploitation. Um, Bell hooks also kind of critiques feminism in this sense of, in its origins, when it was kind of like this sense of white feminism, was really trying to be kind of having equal power with the oppressor. So trying to achieve a power equivalent to their white male counterpart, instead of being a kind of a movement of solidarity around other groups who were also facing oppression. So that kind of becomes really important to kind of think of it as, kind of in its origins as being, finding its way, but also being problematic in some ways. And Hooks kind of goes further to kind of say, well, because it was kind of always located with this kind of problem and kind of trying to assert feminism and defend it and its necessity, with kind of going back to this kind of man hating or men not seeing feminism as being something important to them, it became stuck in that place of kind of always having to. Defend itself. So instead of kind of moving on to thinking through things like what alternative masculinity might look like, what boyhood might be, there was kind of a failure there, or kind of a lack there of not being able to get to that. Hooks also kind of implicates patriarchy in this sense of belonging to the state, so it being militaristic, being aggressive in the sense of kind of belonging to the state in terms of a tool that the state uses to carry out, I guess, white supremacist capitalism. And that becomes really important in terms of thinking about patriarchy on this kind of multi-level, and how we are kind of complicit or implicated by that or impacted by that. So it also kind of locates it within this male domination of the planet. So really bringing it into this kind of environmentalism and who we are as people on this planet. And I think that becomes really important. She speaks about patriarchy hurting men, but also that patriarchy isn't just about men. It's also about everybody can participate in patriarchy. And she tells a story about the main person in her life who was patriarchal, being her mother. And that kind of changes. So there is this sense of transformation through that, because when her mother realizes what feminism means for her daughters and what it allows them, she kind of changes her perspective and mind. So there is this transformational, transformative justice side to that in that story as well. So we kind of sat with some of these thoughts, and we're thinking specifically around alternative masculinity, that point of like, we've never got to that point of where we can think about that, or do that work. And I think this is where we kind of realize that with transmasculinity, this is something that we probably do take on board, in terms of we're coming to our masculinity and thinking about that, thinking about what that means. Yeah, so we kind of talked about that and what that meant for us. And some of us mentioned kind of looking to non-Western models of male intimacy or masculine intimacy, which is also non-sexual intimacy. Some of us also kind of debated that we can't really look romantically or romanticize non-Western cultures, because they also have their own patriarchy. And yeah, we were kind of thinking about how do we navigate that. We also thought about how we navigate speaking about kind of our masculinity on individualistic kind of terms, in terms of the self, but also how we think about it as a structure and a system that we're a part of. Hooks also goes on later in the chapter to discuss that individualistic divesting of patriarchy doesn't work. So yeah, we were thinking about how do we do that within our communities. We realized that this chapter's fairly long. The session was only 2 hours, and there's much more to think about in terms of patriarchy. So, thinking about things like media and heterosexist mass media compared to our own kind of self-representation in our own medias, and how kind of how our masculinity is impacted, quite importantly through kind of media and media representation. We also spoke about boyhood, and how as transmasculine people we come to kind of the sense of boyhood also even in a problematic way, in terms of kind of we are forced into boyhood, or we're not seen as kind of men, or yeah, how we're kind of viewed by society as kind of infantile and adolescent, and how we get stuck in that place. So yeah, thinking about bell hooks's kind of comment about how we really need to think through boyhood, but also feeling that as transmasculine people we're often kind of stuck within that place of boyhood. So yeah, there was a lot to kind of think through, and yeah, we looked through these two resources, but realized we need to do more listening and more reading, and maybe look at some other resources as well. We really kind of appreciated how bell hooks, as well as Adrienne Marie Brown, really come through, come to this topic with this kind of sense, or this methodology of love. And there's a quote here at the end. As long as men dominate women, we cannot have love between us. But also, visionary feminism is wise and loving politics. It's rooted in a love of male and female being, refusing to privilege one over the other. So while we located the problem of being stuck within this kind of binary of male and female, and wanting to kind of move outside or beyond that, we also kind of really appreciated this kind of sense or methodology of love. And we talked about how important it is to to love ourselves, and then how to extend that love beyond ourselves to other people, and that becoming really important as a tool, a strategy of resistance. So that was all that we focused on in this session. We didn't really get into huge detail of our relationship to feminisms, but we will be doing that within our next session, which is focused on trans feminism. There's still some spaces for that. So if you want to book, you can do that through Healing Justice London via their Eventbrite. Thanks a lot.